In sports, the scoreboard doesn't tell the full story, but Netflix does. Stories about dads who happen to be world-class quarterbacks and a battle for the heart, soul, and direction of the multi-billion-dollar business of F1. Whether you're a diehard fan or you're brand new, Netflix has the stories for every type of fan. You can watch these incredible sports stories like Quarterback, F1 Drive to Survive, Untold, and many more now on Netflix.
Apple Card is the credit card created by Apple. You earn 3% daily cash back up front when you use it to buy a new iPhone 15, AirPods, or any products at Apple. And you can automatically grow your daily cash at 4.15% annual percentage yield when you open a high-yield savings account. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone. Apple Card subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Savings accounts by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, member FDIC. Terms apply.
Hello and welcome to a new podcast, The Paddock and the Pavilion with Stephen Wallace. In each show, Stephen will interview someone connected to the world of horse racing or cricket.
Hello everyone, today we are mixing both sports, cricket and horse racing. My guest today is Ken Rutherford, the former New Zealand Test captain, who is now in charge of Hawkesbury Racecourse in northwest Sydney. How are you this evening, Ken?
Yeah, Stephen, very, very well, mate. Look, we're well into autumn here in Sydney. It's a beautiful day. I actually live in Castle Hill in Sydney, so it's about a 35-minute trek each day to the Hawkesbury and back again. But nice. 25 degrees here today, lovely autumn day, and looking forward to some really good racing over the weekend.
Well, thank you. Well, thanks for joining us. I'm looking forward to our chat this morning here in the UK. You've got a glass of red wine with you. It's the first time I've had a guest with a glass of red wine. How have you been coping with COVID, that dreaded word, for the last 12 months?
Well, I started here at Hawkesbury 1st of February 2020, so it was about sort of 7 weeks before COVID really struck around the world. And the first day I arrived at the Hawkesbury from Cambridge in the Waikato in New Zealand, Stephen, it was 46 degrees the day I flew into Sydney, so I went straight to the pub where the air conditioning was turned full on, I tell you. But 7 weeks later, the world turned upside down. So I went back to New Zealand to be with my family through the lockdown in Australia and New Zealand at that time, and came back sort of mid-May, I suppose, and then did my sort of winter here and early spring here in Australia 2020, and then came back to New Zealand over Christmas time to be with my family again, and have been back here in Hawkesbury sort of since January. So things are pretty much back to normal. I know in the UK it's been a long lockdown. I mean, you guys have really gone through it the last sort of 3 or 4 months. Here in Australia and in New Zealand as well, it's been less of an issue, I guess. I mean, obviously it's an issue, a big one, but in terms of the the everyday life, things have been pretty much back to normal for some time here.
Well, thanks for that. We're slowly coming out of it here. Can you tell listeners what your role is at Hawkesbury Racecourse?
So I'm the CEO at Hawkesbury Race Club. So basically you have your metropolitan clubs or club, which is the Australian Turf Club, which is at Ramwick and at Rose Hill, where they have the majority of the Saturday meetings in metropolitan Sydney under the Australian Turf Club auspices. And then they have midweek and Friday night meetings at Canterbury and at Warwick Farm. So there's 4 tracks in metropolitan Sydney. And then you've got 5 provincial clubs around New South Wales, classed as provincial standard clubs, which is Newcastle, Wyong, Gosford, Kembla Grange, which is down by Wollongong, and here at Hawkesbury. So we're the sort of next tier down. So we have 25 meetings a year, I reckon, about right. 4 or 5 Saturdays, 4 or 5 Sundays, a lot of Thursdays, and a few Tuesday meetings. So our big meeting is the Hawkesbury Gold Cup meeting, which was here on Hawkesbury about 10 days ago. The start of May, the first Saturday in May, we had about 5,000 people there that day, Stephen. Good old day. Group 3 race, the Hawkesbury Gold Cup's been going since 1860 something or other. It's one of the oldest races on the Australian racing calendar. It was won for the second time by a horse called Archidemus, pretty much led all the way. Another Group 3 race on the day and a couple of listed races as well, and so it's our biggest day. But we're pretty much a support card to the real good stuff that happens in metropolitan Sydney.
Yeah, well, I've been to Newcastle and I've been to Rose Hill, courtesy of a mutual friend of ours who I'd like to shout out here is Shane Meany, who introduced me to you. So he's taken me to those two courses, but he hasn't taken me to Hawkesbury.
Well, if you do come to Hawkesbury, Stephen, you'll be welcomed with a cold schooner of 4X Gold and maybe one of these cheeky Grand Burge red wines, or probably a de Bottley red wine, actually. And also the finest oysters and scallops you're ever going to eat on a racetrack anywhere in the world, sir.
Oh, well, that sounds appetising. When we're ever going to be able to fly out to Australia again is another matter, really. But
that's right.
Let's go back to your cricketing days. I know your brother Ian played for Otago, and he's 8 years older than you. Is that how you started playing cricket, bowling to him in the garden?
Yeah, a bit of that. I mean, Ian played for Otago at 17 years of age, so I was about 9. But my parents came from Aberdeen in Scotland, Stephen, and they came out to New Zealand in about 1951, around then. And it's a bit sketchy, the details about their trip. They weren't married at the time, so in those days that was quite a major thing, I'd imagine. And if you talk to them both, they had every intention of leaving Southampton with the first stop on the route being Cape Town in South Africa. Had a couple of weeks walking around Cape Town, didn't like it much. I don't know why you wouldn't like it much, because I've been there. It's not a bad place. Then headed to Fremantle. Didn't like Fremantle too much, which is probably fair enough back in 1951. Went to Melbourne. Didn't like Melbourne at all. And then the last stop on the journey was Wellington. And so I kind of stuck there. And my father, having been a servant of the British Army in Italy in World War II, had an apprenticeship as a plumber after that. Couldn't find any work in Scotland, so ended up getting some work in Balclutha, which is south of Dunedin in South Otago. And actually his first job was helping to build the Balclutha Hospital, which is still there today. So that's how we ended up down south in Dunedin. And that's where the Rutherford family the roots grow from that time.
And then you, I can certainly vouch for Cape Town. I've been there myself, so I don't know why they left Cape Town. You'd have finished up playing for South Africa then. But you made your debut for Otago yourself at 17, and Ian was playing in that game. Did you play many games with him?
Yeah, the last game Ian played was against Central Districts in Invercargill at the Queen's Oval in Invercargill, and him and I put on about 50, I think, together in a rain-affected game, and it was, I think, still my first season. So he sort of got to the stage where he was toward mid-20s and had to finish his BCom, his accounting degree, and had to make a decision those days, I guess, in terms of playing a bit more cricket and not earning a lot of money. I mean, back in those days, I recall when we were travelling north to go and play Auckland, Canterbury, Wellington or whoever, we used to get to Momona Airport at Dunedin and receive a little brown envelope, and it pretty much contained $12 a day, which was enough for a $2 box quinella, a pie and a pint, Stephen. So, yeah, you weren't there for the money in those days. You were there for a lot of fun and a lot of good times and a lot of good cricket, but that was about it. So I think my brother, by the time he was 25 or 26, had pretty much decided that financially wise, it wasn't going to be a great idea to keep playing domestic cricket in New Zealand back in about 82, 83, and decided to finish his accounting degree and moved up to Central Otago, where I ended up going about 2 years later and playing the next level down, sort of sub-association cricket in New Zealand, which is Hawke Cup cricket, and played with him at Central Otago and had 2 great years up there.
Yeah, you weren't quite playing to IPL salaries in those days, were you?
No, as I say, $12 was a $2 box quinella, a pie and a pint. And mind you, warm-ups were a cup of tea and a biscuit too. So these days, when I watch my son Hamish warm up before a game of, say, T20 in particular, it's they've got a hell of a sweat on, and they're proper athletes these days.
Well, 2 years later, after your first-class debut, you made your Test debut against the West Indies. You probably want to drink a bit more of that wine when I talk about this.
Should have had some before I faced my first ball. Yeah.
So you played against the West Indies in Port of Spain. That's as a 19-year-old opening the batting against some quite tame bowling of Michael Holding, Malcolm Marshall, Joel Garner and people like Courtney Walsh. You made a pair on your Test debut. Were you ready for the experience was it too soon when you got selected?
Oh, clearly too soon. There's no doubt about that. I think I played 8 first-class games of cricket prior to that for Otago and got 100 against Auckland at Eden Park number 2. Bruce Edgar, who was the erstwhile and very sound companion to John Wright, wasn't he, at the top of the New Zealand order for a number of years. He was unavailable, nor was John F. Reid, who had been a very good servant of New Zealand cricket as well, who sadly passed away last year. So there weren't too many other options, I guess, in those days for the selectors. And I guess I was seen as a young guy who's always had scored runs at age group cricket coming through, and was a guy who could maybe go to the West Indies and be the third opener and maybe the reserve batsman and sort of not play all 4 Test matches as ended up happening. So I was thrust upon it. I think the worst thing I did, Stephen, was the game before the first Test at Port of Spain. I scored 100 against Courtney Walsh, Tony Merrick, who you might recall played for Warwickshire for a number of years.
Yeah.
And a guy I think called Aaron Daly, who bowled, a skitty guy who played in their local competition. He was quite quick as well. So I got 100 in that game and pretty much had to get picked for the first Test match at Port of Spain. And I've got to be honest, I mean, I was probably a bit naive. No, not a bit, highly naive about what lay ahead of me. I thought, well, I've scored runs reasonably consistently through schoolboy and age group cricket in New Zealand. I'll be okay. I'll be right. But obviously, I mean, it was just a step up by the extreme, by 100 steps, by 1,000 steps up to what I'd faced before, and to face Malcolm and Joel and Michael, and then you've got Courtney coming up, or I think Patrick Patterson was still around. Winston Davis played a few games as well. It was pretty tough. The second innings, though, was interesting of that Test match to complete the pair, and then I got run out without facing a ball. So,
what happened there? I
feel a bit aggrieved by that, quite frankly.
What happened with the run out without facing? It's the worst way to get out for anyone.
Well, I think Righty being the kind-hearted soul that he is, he thought on the 6th ball of the first over of the second innings from Marshall, I better try and protect young Ruds at the other end, and hit it straight to Roger Harper, who was on as a substitute fieldsman, and called yes. And then followed it with yes, no, wait, but I was already halfway down, but I was out by a yard, of course. But that was pretty soul-destroying, the fact that I couldn't contribute to my own demise in the second dig. It was done without my facing the ball.
Well, Graham Gooch got a pair in his first Test as well. So, but what was it?
I'll tell you something though. My first scoring shot in Test cricket was in the next Test at Guyana. Joel Garner bowled me this lovely leg cutter, and I found the gap between second and third slip at very catchable height, about the stomach height. I don't know what Viv was doing at second slip or Richie Richardson was doing at third slip. They weren't looking at the ball, so I could have had 3 in a row quite easily.
Well, they were the best side in the world, and probably even the best Test cricket side of all time. And we've got Viv playing, Desmond Haynes, Gordon Greenidge, Richie Richardson in the batting lineup, and we've mentioned the bowlers. And your highest score in the series was 5.
Hell of an effort, that. I mean,
that was the last innings as well. Yeah,
you couldn't plan that, could you? I mean, 5. And so yeah, I recall the last innings quite vividly, because it was, I think I walked out there to the bat with about 45 minutes to go to the stumps, and Jeremy Coney had just broken his arm, and he had nicked a bit of his forearm, so there was a bit of blood coming out as he was lying prostrate across the crease line. I remember with 45 minutes to go walking out and taking guard, and there was a pool of blood where your bat goes to take guard. And Desmond Haynes with short legs was saying, "Oh, young Rutherford," he says, "how does that feel with that blood? You've got to kick that blood away." I mean, that was pretty tough. And I remember getting through actually to stumps, being 5 not out, thinking that's pretty good. It was 5:30 was stumps time, and the clock on the ground at Sabina Park in Jamaica just turned 5:32. So I was walking off, and the umpires said, "No, one more over to go," and I got out about the third ball. So that was pretty soul destroying. That was probably the saddest I've ever felt in a cricket field, to be frank. But let's have another little sip of red wine.
Yeah. All seriousness now, when batsmen have a bad spell, it must have been very hard and difficult playing against that bowling and having a run of low scores like that.
Yeah, well, I guess I kind of married it, or bounced it off against the fact that I was 19 and I was incredibly naive, obviously, and I thought I'd do pretty well, and probably I wasn't as naive as the selectors would have picked in the first place, perhaps, but I kind of felt that it was all going to be a lot better from there on in, and it probably took 3 or 4 years to kind of get a bit better. Cricket's a game of statistics, isn't it? So when people look at my average, I finished with being about 27 or 28 Test cricket, they sort of go, well, that's pretty average in terms of where averages are these days. But I kind of back in mind go, well, none of you guys started with your first 7 innings as being averaging 1.71.
No, that just takes some beating. But you did get back in the side in early 1986, a very strong New Zealand side that had won away in Australia, and then you were playing at home against Australia, a series that you won 1-0. And you also came across to the UK in 86 and again beat England in England. Is that the best New Zealand side there's ever been, or how does it compare to the current side?
That's a question that a lot of my era of New Zealand cricketers have been asked of, and it's a bit of a cliche, isn't it, Stephen, where you can't compare an era to an era. I'd say that the present situation in New Zealand cricket is a squad, the greatest squad. You basically draw, I reckon, 20 to 25 players who could represent New Zealand very, very well across the 3 formats. Whereas in the 80s, you had your Hadley and you had your Crow, and you had really good players like Coney, Wright, Jeff Crow, Edgar, Johnny F. Reid, Snedden, Bracewell, who all contributed, Ian Smith obviously as well. I've left guys out, I'm sure, who could all contribute very, very well. But the overall numbers, in terms of today's numbers, comparatively speaking, weren't quite there. I think the 11 that we would put on the field in 1986, which was a halcyon time for New Zealand cricket, would probably compare pretty favourably to now. But it is so hard to be comparative about that. But the 85, 86 time and leading up to when he retired in 1990, I mean, Richard Hadley was he was the difference. And I look back on my own career, and a lot of my memories about New Zealand Test victories are built around Hadley performances. I mean, we beat India to step ahead a couple of years, Steve, in 1988 in Bombay, which was unheard of. And it was on the back of a marvellous effort by Richard Hadley with the ball. John Bracewell bowled well and got some important wickets. Andrew Jones played amazingly in the second innings, got a 70 or an 80 from memory, and batted for a long, long time on a wicket that was impossible to bat on. But a lot of my personal memories of playing for New Zealand and winning Test matches for New Zealand are built on what Richard Hadley did.
Moving forward, Richard wasn't there in 1992 when in a home World Cup, New Zealand reached the semi-final and you won 7 of your 8 matches. What was it like playing 7 of your 8 group matches? What was it like playing in a home World Cup?
Well, it's something we all aspired to do. I mean, I recall playing in 91 and, 6 to 12 months beforehand and thinking to myself, well, I've got to get myself in that 14. It was something you really, really want to do. And we'd gone pretty poorly, quite frankly, as a team leading up to that World Cup. I think we played England in a 4 or 5 match one-day series leading into it and lost all games. And so we had no expectation. I mean, a lot of people forget that for that first game at Eden Park against Australia, which was normally a packed house, you should have 40,000 there playing Australia in a normal ODI, notwithstanding the fact that it's actually a World Cup game. We only had half full there. It was about 18 to 20,000 people there. So the levels of expectation were pretty low. Crow got 100 or a 90. I got a few from memory as well. We got about 230, 240, and we restricted them to about 215, 218, something like that. David Boone, I seem to recall, got about 90 odd. But that was the catalyst that built the momentum to see us go right through the whole competition. So we had a rain-affected game at Napier. We beat Zimbabwe. We beat Sri Lanka at Hamilton. I can remember each of the games pretty much verbatim, to be honest. We beat India at Carisbrook. We beat England at Basin Reserve, etc. And then, of course, we got beaten in the semi-final by Pakistan, which is the one we all focus on.
Yeah, I mean, that first game against Australia, you did get a half century yourself, and you also got a half century in that semi-final against Pakistan.
Yeah, don't talk me about that. It took me 24 balls to get off the mark.
It wouldn't be good for strike rates these days, would it?
No, I don't know what happened there. Mushtaq Ahmed, I always had problems with Mushtaq Ahmed, the Pakistan leg spinner. Everyone else seemed to think they could pick him, but I couldn't. I reckon everyone else lied; they couldn't pick him either. But he was a great bowler, and I don't know. I froze at the crease for 24 balls, and eventually he shook me awake and said, "Mate, you just got smashed next on for 4," and I did, and things went pretty good from there on in. But I think we got 260 odd, I think, batting first, which is probably a defendable total. But
262.
Yeah, in those days, as you know, that's a decent score in those days. But Inzamam come out and played unbelievable. The partnership between me and Dad and Imran was unreal. They just paced the innings perfectly through the middle stages. Well, perfectly in the end. But a lot's been said about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a World Cup where the two teams that played best in the group matches, England and New Zealand, neither of them finished up winning the competition. Yeah,
that's right. I seem to remember Pakistan had a rained-off game where they got half points, and if they hadn't, and they were losing that rained-off game, it might have been against South Africa, when Jonty had that run out. I'm not 100% sure. I'm probably wrong, but they picked up a point through an abandoned game. If they hadn't have picked up that point, they would have made the semi-finals.
Well, let's go a bit further forward. January 1993, when you first captained New Zealand, and then you eventually captained them for 18 Test matches. Was that something you'd always wanted to do, being captain of New Zealand?
No, not at all. I think the fact that I had played at a young age and done pretty poorly, I was kind of surprised by my own progress at all. So captaincy was never something which I aspired to, I guess. Martin Crowe pulled out. I think that game against Pakistan and Hamilton was the first time I captained New Zealand. Martin Crowe had a problem with an injury, and I was kind of given the reins 24 hours before the game started. So I think it helps when you have no expectation of yourself, and probably the public has zero expectation of as a captain as well. But there's a game we probably should have won. I mean, we're chasing a pretty meagre total in the fourth innings of the game, about 120, 130 runs, I think. But Wakar and Wazim came in and did their thing on the last day. So there was no honour lost in terms of that. But I guess captaincy was something which I grew to enjoy and grew to believe that I had a bit of a penchant for it.
And how difficult was it captain aside, because Martin Crowe was out injured quite a bit, and of course Richard Hadley had now retired, so the sort of golden days of New Zealand cricket were a bit behind you, and you captained New Zealand on the England tour in 1994.
94.
Yeah,
it was pretty tough. I mean, obviously, it's a great cliche in sporting teams that you go through a rebuilding period, and we did at that time. I mean, Paddles, Richard, as I said before, 1990 was his last series, and Martin had all those issues with his fitness and his knee in particular through his latter stage of his career. So these are your great two champion cricketers. Prior to that was someone like Glenn Turner, who was, sort of mid-70s to early 80s when he pulled out. So New Zealand those days weren't overly blessed with champion cricketers, but we were always competitive. And I guess the issue we had in the early 90s was maybe we weren't as competitive as we could have been in terms of being a team. But I don't know, you look back and you say yourself, I could have done things a little bit differently. I'm sure in general life people look at that and say that's the case. But, we tried hard. We had a couple of good wins, but certainly in terms of that rebuilding process, it was a lot of ups and a lot of downs.
Your last of your 56 tests and 121 one-day internationals were in 1995. against Sri Lanka. Were you surprised to be dropped at that time? Because I looked up your last 3 scores in one-day internationals, and you did quite well.
Yeah, you should read my book, actually. I've kind of pinpointed it there, but no, I'm just being a bit flippant there. I don't know. I guess from a personal perspective, it was time to move on as well. I mean, I remember Jeremy Coney, the very sage Coney, saying to me at a very early stage of my career, probably in the West Indies actually, that a career is not sort of bound by your age. It's bound by the time you spend within it. And although in 1995 I was still only 29 years of age, which is quite young in terms of, your ability to play on as a cricketer, I was quite old, very old, archaic almost in terms of my experiences. And I think when you, like any job, work or whatever, sometimes you get a bit sour about life and you just need a refresh in general. So I think looking back at that sort of time, the 94, 95, around that time was probably a time for KR Rutherford and New Zealand cricket to part ways anyway. So, I went to South Africa, which might be your next question, and had every intention of going to South Africa and playing for Transvaal for 2 seasons and do that and get some runs hopefully and enjoy myself and get things back on track and find the joie de vivre about cricket again, and then come back to New Zealand and try and play again. But I enjoyed myself so much in South Africa that I pretty much stayed there.
Yeah, you played there for, I think, 5 seasons, and you were the South African Cricket of the Year in 2000. Just loved it.
I can't speak high enough of my time there and the friends and family I have over there and my cricketing and life experiences that I've had in South Africa. And it's a marvellous country. Obviously, in the mid-90s with Mandela taking over, the country was in a state of euphoria, great change and positiveness about the way that they were going to go forward. And one of my great sporting memories is being in South Africa when the African Nations Football Cup was on in 1996 and South Africa winning that, and just the outpouring of support for their local team. And it was far superior to the 1995 Rugby World Cup win by the same country. So, no, I enjoyed it. From a cricketing perspective, it was unreal. I mean, the provincial system there, the Currie Cup system was very, very strong through the 90s when you played Western Province. You played against guys like Desmond Haynes and Brian McMillan and Gary Kirsten, etc. When you played Natal, you played against Sean Pollock and Malcolm Marshall and Jonty Rhodes, etc. You went through to Orange Free State where they had lots of Alan Donald and others. And each province had a really, really strong side. So cricketing-wise, my ambitions didn't diminish at all. And life-wise, it was just a great time.
Did you ever have a chance of playing county cricket over here then?
Oh, looking back, I would have liked to have. I mean, I never really explored the possibility with having 2 Scottish parents and having a British passport as I do myself now, but so I never really explored it. And I guess in those days, Stephen, particularly through the 80s, you had West Indian fast bowlers aplenty playing. I mean, even Wrighty, when Wrighty would talk about Derbyshire, with Michael Holding and Derby as well, they would pick their games where Holding would play and when Wrighty would play. And, it was a green seamer, obviously Holding would play, and there was a flat one John might play. But I would have loved to play county cricket. It's something my son has achieved and is going to be back over there very shortly playing for Glamorgan.
Oh, he's playing for Glamorgan because he played for Worcestershire last year, didn't he? Yeah.
He played for Worcester last year. He's played for Essex in the past and Derby. And he's got a contract for a couple of months from July with Glamorgan.
Well, with your British passport, you'd have been a certainty being picked now if you'd have been the right age, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, that's right. I'd like to think so anyway. But no, I toured England 3 times, 86, 90 and 94, and loved it. I mean, you go to those grounds, some of them aren't great. Watching a guy called Bernie Mayer score a century in 1986 at Derbyshire, when it was about -2 degrees, and he took all day to get his 100. That wasn't one of the great experiences. But then you go to some other great grounds, don't you? Some of the obvious ones being the test venues, but some really terrific little grounds like Swansea. Let me think. I mean, there's some other really nice grounds around the place where you go to and you think you're pretty lucky to be playing there.
Well, you've got some nice grounds in New Zealand as well. But let's turn to your other sport, racing. And to start with, when you were playing cricket, did you used to nip off to the races? Were you someone who, when you were playing, had you got bets on in races and things like that, a la sort of Keith Miller and Sir Gary Sobers?
Of course. The only time I've ever gone off the park to watch a race, I only ever did it once. That was at the Wanderers in Johannesburg, where very good friends of mine, Gary and Dean Alexander, who were trainers at Turfing team in Johannesburg, and they now really came to Australia. Actually, they really came to Murray Bridge in South Australia. They had a good chance in a big race in South Africa called the Metropolitan, the Met, down at Kenilworth in Cape Town. And we were fielding, and Jimmy Cook, our coach, was also pretty keen on the horses. And I said, Jimmy, look, I've had a decent bet on this horse from the Alexander stable. We're fielding. My hamstring might need some treatment for 10 minutes. So I hopped off at about 3:33 p.m. the Saturday afternoon when we were fielding, and I felt a bit bad about it, actually, but the game was going nowhere, so I went upstairs and watched the race and came back out. But that's the only time. But I think it's safe to say that I think in the old days, certainly playing for Otago, where I grew up, if you weren't having a punt, you weren't part of the team.
So how did your interest in racing start then? Was it at a young age?
Well, you talked about my brother Ian. Well, I've got another brother, Neil, who's 2 years younger than Ian. So he's into his harness horses, or was, and still is. And so when he left school, he started mucking out with a trotting trainer up in Christchurch called Freeman Holmes, who had two really good horses, a horse called Noodlem, who's I think still got the record on New Zealand harness racing, having the most consecutive wins, which is Muldoon Backwards, who you'll know is a Prime Minister from New Zealand from the 70s. So it was about 73, 4, Noodlem was running around for Freeman. And a horse called Olga Corbett, named after the Russian gymnast. So from an early age, I was influenced by my two older brothers. I think one you'd say positively from a cricket perspective, or maybe not. And one you'd say negatively, or maybe not from a racing perspective, being my other brother Neil.
So how did your horse racing journey start to where you are now? I know you've worked in South Africa, and I know you've worked in the betting industry as well. I
think when I finished playing cricket, when I was 34, I was very, very keen to do something else outside of the game. I got to a stage where it was, I felt I had, cricket was just cricket was just me. I mean, I needed to do something else, and I don't know. I like racing. I like punting. I still like punting, and I don't think it's a bad thing to say. You follow horses and you do a punt and things like that. I don't think it's an overly PC thing to say, and I just felt like that was something I'd like to get involved in. I was lucky enough to get my first job after cricket as being a bookmaker for the TAB in New Zealand on soccer. I've always followed my football, love soccer, and all sports really, and it just grew from there. My interest in getting involved and more about racing and punting and wagering and I find the people you meet in these kind of spheres they're good people, and I've really enjoyed it since.
But you've also worked, I think, in Singapore and New Zealand in horse racing as well.
Yeah, not so much Singapore and horse racing. I was actually in charge of their sports betting in Singapore, working for the government there in a company called Singapore Pools, and that was to do with football. The local betting on the football in Singapore, also international betting as well. So we were there from 2006 to 2011, then went back to South Africa and worked in horse racing there in terms of their media and communications and stuff like that, and the TV, and then came back to the Waikato Racing Club in Hamilton, New Zealand, and ran the race club there. So I guess when you look at my interest in horse racing and wagering, it's kind of quite rounded. I probably most enjoy the wagering side of things and look at the way that goes, but running a racing club is also a lot of fun.
So when you've been in the UK here, have you watched any of the major races over here as well?
I was very lucky when I was working for Pumalala in South Africa about 2012, around then, I went to a conference at Chelsea at Stamford Bridge and had a day at Newmarket, Dewhurst Day, a horse called Dawn Approach. I won the Dewhurst, I reckon, that day. I think Jim Bolger was training a horse just sold to Godolphin. I stand to be corrected.
That's right. It's about 2012, 2013, that sort of time, aren't we? Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So I was lucky enough to be invited out to the parade ring there with the shakes and everything else. That was a bit of a highlight for me, actually. But they had a race on the card, Stephen, and you probably know more about it than I do, but it started in one county and finished in another, called the Cambridgeshire Cup, I think it was.
The Cambridgeshire.
Yeah, 4,000-metre race. I mean, jeepers. The only 4,000-metre races, obviously, in New Zealand or Australia, ones where you actually jump over some jumps, but this was a flat race. And,
the Cambridgeshire is just a mile and a furlong. We also have the Cesarewitch, which is just over 2 miles. So it's probably the Cesarewitch.
That might be the race. Yeah, it might be something like that. It was something else. But I remember these specks in the distance coming from miles away, and people were saying, well, there's a horses there. I'm thinking, jeepers, I watched it on TV. It's too far away. But like Newmarket, I haven't been to Ascot yet. I'd love to get to Ascot. I've been to Leicester a couple of times, been to North Nottingham. I played league cricket in Hull when I was young, after the West Indies, actually, 1985. And went to Pontefract and Beverley and a few of the courses around there, and loved those. Loved Pontefract, actually. Terrific course. But really, I really enjoy those aspects of just turning up with a T-shirt and shorts and jandals and just going somewhere with a can of beer and your race guide, just sitting by the side of the road and watching a couple of races.
Right, and you've also worked as a Sky Sports commentator. So I was going to ask your point of view on the New Zealand team that are shortly to be touring the UK. We've got 2 tests, one at Lords and one at Edgbaston, and they're playing India in the World Test Championship final at the Ageas Bowl.
Well, firstly, can I say, and I was really surprised by this news, as you might have been as well. 2 days ago, BJ Watling announced his retirement from Test cricket and from all cricket, actually. And he's someone who slips under the radar quite a bit, doesn't he? I mean, it's a record when you look at it and when you compare it against other Test wicketkeeper batsmen over the history of Test matches. His record will stack up against anyone's. I mean, he's been incredible, and he's a quiet guy. I did a bit of work with Northern Districts Cricket 3 or 4 years ago. I was on the board there, and then a bit of work selecting as well. And just a hell of a good guy, a solid guy. He'd be the one guy in your team you want to have in your team, because he's just one of those quiet guys who goes about his work. So I think big kudos to him, the fact that he's getting out on his own terms and getting out at the top of his game. And and the reason I mention that, Stephen, is because I reckon that sort of guy will motivate this New Zealand side in his last tour to actually, really achieve maximum benefit from the tour. Look, this side is terrifically led by Kane Williamson. His achievements as a captain, nothing compared to what he would achieve as a batsman. He's going to break all sorts of records from a New Zealand perspective when he finishes playing. The support act is unbelievable. I mean, in terms of Tom Latham, I think in his own right would be a standout performer in any other era for New Zealand cricket. Ross Taylor, obviously, as well. They've got a guy there from Johannesburg who went to Kiers and Joburg School, where Neil McKenzie went, Graham Smith went, and others went. A guy called Devon Conway, who Englishmen may not have seen. Well, when you see him, you'll remember him because he can play. And he's a serious player, and he's someone New Zealand cricket will get in their top 6, and he'll score runs. And their bowling attack. I mean, what do you do? Who do you leave out? Jemison's come on board. His numbers in the last 12 or 15 months are unreal. We all know about Bolton Southey and Wagner. Goodness, I mean, every team needs a Neil Wagner. He's the battery that never ceases to lose energy. I mean, so I don't want to talk us up too much, Stephen, but I am. And good luck, England, really.
Well, thanks for that. You certainly got the bowling attack for our conditions early season, although we have had a very dry spring here, although the last couple of weeks it's rained virtually non-stop. So probably the weather now that's going to start suiting your bowling. And BJ Watling, I know what he's like, having been like you were, although I didn't know you, of course, at the time at the Mount Maunganui tests when he get 200, I think, didn't he, in that game?
With Mitchell Santner, didn't he? Mitchell Santner got 100 as well. So he's just one of those guys. I think he came to New Zealand when he was 12 or 13 from Durban. I think New Zealand's been a bit of a location of choice for South Africans who moved there, and they've all got a point to prove, I guess, to some extent. Wagner's a good example. That Grant Elliott was too. Devon Conway is. But Watling's just incredible, and I think you'll find he'll stay in the game. I believe he's pretty keen to coach, and he's the sort of guy as a coach you just think to yourself, well, he's going to do it all there as well.
And the final against India, that should be a good game with the Indian bowling attack and their batting lineup as well.
I mean, you look around you're talking about the 80s before where we were. Batting against some of the 80s bowling attacks was pretty hard work. We had pretty much every country around the world had good bowlers. It's getting a bit back to that now, isn't it? England got a good bowling attack. Likes of Mark Wood, obviously Anderson, Broad, and others. Wokes, I think, is outstanding, is terrific in those conditions. India probably got half a dozen who could play. Pakistan got a very good bowling attack. South Africa haven't got a bad one. New Zealand got a very good one, and Australia have got an outstanding one. So you're getting back to a situation now where the bowlers have got some kind of sway, whereas I think the batsmen at some stages in the early 2000s had a bit too much going their way.
Well, it looks like we've gone full circle from when you started your Test career a little bit. So perhaps a good time to finish today's podcast. Thank you very much for joining me on the Paddock and the Pavilion. Good luck to New Zealand in the final. Not so much good luck in the 2 games against England. And best luck for the racing at Hawkesbury for the rest of the season.
Stephen, it's been very enjoyable, and I've managed to get through about half a bottle of red wine. So let me sit back and watch a bit of the Italian Open from Rome, tennis. I understand Berrettini is playing Tsitsipas shortly, so that's going to be me for the next hour or so.
Yeah, he's good to watch, yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Cheers, Stephen.
Thank you for listening to the Paddock and the Pavilion. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and now on Instagram at the Pad and Pad. Don't forget, if you like the show, please do leave us a rating and review.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
We all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, and it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once, and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.